And Michel, how you doing?
Hi, Joe. Doing
Hey,
well. And you?
awesome. Yeah, thanks. Good. So today on the Data Nerd Herd, we have Michel Tricot. So for people who don't know who you are, do you want to give a quick intro?
Yeah, of course. So I'm the co-founder and I'm the CEO of a company called Airbyte. And what we do is we provide an open source data platform for integrating data from and moving data from any sources to any destination. And yeah, I'm originally from France, been living in the US for the past 10 years. So that's why I'm been working the data space for 15 years now.
Oh, wow. It's quite a while, actually. What got you started in the data space?
Uh, I started out of college working in the finance industry and working on like collecting data from estimates, like financial estimates for companies, and like how do you pull this data in, how do you QA it, and how do you then distribute it to traders and people who are going to leverage this consolidated data. So that was my first baby step in the data world.
Interesting. I mean, what kept you going, though? I mean, as somebody with tech and data skills, you could go in a number of directions. I mean, what kept you going in the data field?
Um, I would say I'm a bit of a knowledge hoarder to some extent, and I really like the idea of data is knowledge. And I think once you can bring the data in the right place and process it the right way and like just consolidate it the right way, you have an edge on the world and on anything you're doing. And that's been a trend in my life on data.
Interesting. That's a pretty good insight, actually. It sort of kind of follows the knowledge is power thing.
But knowledge is fragmented. So you need to first get all these data pieces, put it together, and then that becomes knowledge.
Right. That's awesome. I guess fast forward to Airbyte. I mean, what kind of happened in between you getting into data 15 years ago, then deciding to work on this project?
Yeah. So I've actually when I arrived in the US, I started at a company called LiveRamp, and I stayed there from very early stage up to the IPO. And I was leading a team of engineers, like 30 engineers. And what we were doing was really about integrating LiveRamp into the ad tech and martech ecosystem. And we were moving data at internet scale, like hundreds of terabytes of data, petabytes of data every single day. And we had to basically build, maintain, and scale all these data connectors. And after I left LiveRamp, I went to another company. This one was more like IoT, self-driving cars type of a company. But the data challenges at the root were the same that the one I saw when I was at LiveRamp and when I was in that financial company. And with my co-founder, John, he was facing similar issues at his startup. And that's when we decided to look at the problem space of data integration and try to figure out what is missing and why are companies investing so much in building data connectors, building data integration. And that's really how we got started with Airbyte. We had a problem space in mind, and we were just at that point figuring out what is a solution for that problem.
Interesting. Around what time was this? What year do you think that was?
I mean, we brainstormed before we started the company, but we officially started the company on January 1st, 2020.
Oh, wow.
And we went through YC at that point, Y Combinator. Back in the day, we really went into YC with the idea of the problem space and both of our expertise on solving this type of issues. Now, what we did do while we were at YC was really around okay, what are some very specific problems that we can solve so that we can start building a product on top of it and something that people actually need for their data issues. We started on the marketing side. COVID hit in March in the US. And at that point, we realized that we had to pivot the product a bit and address an audience more data savvy audience. And in July, that's when we started the Airbyte project, the way people know it today. So that's been a bit of our way to start Airbyte. So a lot of, and talking to a lot of customers all the time. That's the only thing we're doing for the first 3 months of our lives at Airbyte.
Interesting. And is that talking to customers seems to be a pretty big thing that like YC hits on as well. Just get out there and talk to people. I mean, was that something that they had you do, or was that something you were just doing independent of whether you're in YC or not?
No, we were doing that already before.
Cool.
Before even starting the company. It's just,
yeah,
you know, when you brainstorm ideas, you always find that your ideas is the best. You're going to change the world with this idea. It takes you 2 days to realize that either it's a terrible idea and you should move to another one or another solution. But then even after these 2 days or 3 days, you cannot just evaluate an idea just from your own perspective. That's when you need to start talking to people. And usually you start with your close circle, and then as you get more information about like how you can orient it, then you can start expanding to people that you don't know. And that will give you very, very good information, very good insight, very good feedback.
That's interesting.
And I think like as an entrepreneur, you need to talk to people. You cannot just do something in your room without talking to anybody.
Yeah, I think we can all we've all probably known somebody who's decided to start their business on their laptop without talking to anybody, and that tends to go nowhere pretty quickly. So that's interesting. I mean, what was the feedback when you talk to people? Because I mean, I got to imagine that, especially with the type of product or type of problem that Airbyte's solving, I mean, there's a lot of competition in the space already, and there were a lot of incumbents. I mean, what was some of the feedback that you got early on?
Yeah. So actually, you know, when we pivoted from this marketing idea to really go like more in the data, like understanding the problem of data engineering teams, what we did was more around we knew there are a lot of actors on the market of data. So what we were really trying to understand is why are people still struggling, although there are so many actors on the market. And so what we've done is we went through all the customers that we could find of existing solutions like Fivetran, Stitch, etc. And we started talking with all of them. Like we talked to 50 of them over 2 or 3 months. And what happened is 100% of them were both buying the solution, but rebuilding the solution on the side internally and hiring people to do that, to maintain this connector. And that's really when we realized that these are good solutions, but they only solve like a very small and narrow aspect of the issue. And when you talk to data engineers, then they tell you like, my problem with a solution that I'm paying for is I mean, if the connector is missing, I have to build it internally. I don't have a choice. So they build it and they build everything around it to maintain it, to monitor it, etc. Then they'll tell you they have the connector, but it doesn't work the way I want because they have their own opinion on what it should look like. So they're going to change it and they're going to re-implement it. So the one was, I would love to use them more, but this particular type of data cannot leave my company. I cannot send it to a third-party vendor. Then that was another. So at that point, they need to recreate this connector internally to pull the data. And last one was, this data source is so huge that if the data flows through this third-party vendor, the bill at the end of the month is going to be, I will not be able to justify it. And at that point, it's more efficient for me to just use my time to build it and to maintain it. And these were really the four things that we've discovered. And that's when John and I thought, yeah, the thing that solved that particular problem is having an open source approach and very platform approach to solving the problem.
That's really good insights. I mean, the connector space is something I've been studying often for many years now. So I remember, was it Taylor from Fivetran? I remember he emailed me back in 2015 or 2016. I was saying, I got this idea for this. I got this new product, to hook up Postgres to Redshift. And I'm like, that sounds like the dumbest thing I've ever heard of. I'll just build my own. And of course, I was a dumb one in this exchange because it should, but it was really, I think one of the first times I'd seen, somebody purpose building something for like data warehousing you know, and it wasn't just like Zapier where you can connect things and automate tasks, but it was really purpose built for data workflows. I thought that was, you know, in retrospect, pretty cool. But if you looked at the number of connectors out there, right? I mean, in marketing tech alone, there's like over 8,000 companies and counting. And that's just, that's one niche out of an entire universe. And it's just, so the number of like APIs to connect to, it just seems to be expanding every day. And so, but at the same time, what I noticed is a lot of these companies would start up and it's like, okay, so you have like 50 connectors out of like 1 bajillion connectors. So potential connectors. And so it's an interesting problem to solve.
And what is interesting is, yes, you have like an infinite number of connectors if you think about it. But the thing that remains the same is, how do you operate these connectors? How do you monitor the data and all of that? And that's what we want to also build on top of not just the connector itself, but in terms of like how we orchestrate connectors, how we monitor them, so that you don't have to rebuild. Like you can build a connector, but if you build a connector, you need to build a system around it to maintain it. And we want to make sure that when you go and start using Airbyte, it works out of the box. And now the only thing that you need to do is, if you're missing a connector, you can plug one into the platform. We have like a data protocol to move data from point A to point B. So it's just a matter of like, but building something that obeys the rules of the protocol, and boom, you have your connector infrastructure up and running.
Interesting. So, I mean, when you started the Airbyte project, I mean, what sort of walk me through the trial and error of like building a product like this? You know, like what did you, from a technical perspective, like, you know, when you started out, like what were some of your assumptions? And then I suppose, what did you learn along the way that may have changed your opinions a bit?
So I would say that after we had talked to so many people from like existing solution, we were very convinced about the approach that we were taking. Now, what we didn't realize is that there were use cases that we didn't think about, that people would be using this project for. So, you know, when we were thinking about it initially, it was really geared toward like analytics. Like, I'm a big company, I have fragmented data all over the place. I just want to, and I just bought my super nice, shiny BigQuery or Snowflake warehouse. I just want to bring data to it and get my data analysts, data scientists to find something that will make me a better company. The thing that we did not realize at that time is that there are also a lot of companies who are building connectors to power their product. And they have to maintain these connectors, not for analytics, but just as an enabler for their product. And at that point, we started to see people using Airbyte as a connectivity layer for their product, so that they can focus on the insight and the intrinsic value of their product, and let the connectivity to a system like us. And that is not something we had anticipated initially, but that has been that has taken a lot of our mind to figure out how to build a product for this type of use case.
Interesting. And you've managed to build quite the community around Airbyte as well. I mean, your Slack channel is very active. I mean, so how did, you know, I want to talk about community for a bit too. I think that this is a big topic these days in data and data companies. But what was it? Walk me through that, the whole journey of you know, maybe probably starting with you and you know, your co-founder, and now having, you know, thousands of people in a Slack group. I mean, what was that like?
Yeah, I mean, I would say at the origin is we're very close to the problem that we are solving. We've all had scars of building these systems, and I think that also makes what we talk about very authentic, because we've lived all these problems on a day-to-day basis for like 15 years. Now, in terms of like building the community, I feel we are spending a significant amount of our time on like helping the community. The thing is, we are building the tooling, we are building the infrastructure, but what we want is to also give to the community the ability to build new connectors and to help like maintain connectors. So we have this very tight relationship with everybody who's using Airbyte to ensure that it's almost like customer success for our community. And we make sure that they understand how they can use the platform, they understand like how they can build this connector in an efficient way, et cetera, et cetera. And we spend a large amount of time with our community. We also try to publish relevant content so that we also educate the audience, because in the end, like data is evolving very quickly. What we call data today is not what we call data 15 years ago. Right. With modern data warehouses like the Snowflake and BigQuery, the audience also has changed. It's not just data engineers, it's also people that are maybe less technical, but extremely data savvy. So you need to make sure that you address both like the core data engineer and the data analyst, the data scientist, the analytics engineer, and figure out how you make these two groups of like contributors and users to work well together.
That's interesting. It must, I can imagine that probably presents some interesting challenges with respect to listening to different voices and different perspectives. I mean, how do you take all those different perspectives and figure out, this is what we're going to prioritize for the product and so forth? Yeah.
So I would say there are two sides in that case to the product. One, which is connector, and connectors is universal across data engineers and across analytics engineer or data analyst. Now, what's different is like the way you interact with these connectors. And when we thought about it, we were like, okay, someone who is more on the data science or data analyst side is going to be looking for a UI. Someone who is more on the data engineering side might be more looking for an API or something like that. So we try to just have this evolution of these two way of interacting with Airbyte to go in parallel, and we keep having conversation with both type of users and try to understand, and we try to get all of them to advance in parallel. In general, like the API might be more complex, offer more options, and maybe the UI a little bit less, or sometimes it's the other way around. Like we want a simple API but more complex UI so that you can do more advanced data replication processes.
That's interesting. That's a really good way of looking at it. I think it's interesting too, because it would reflect somebody who, I think, as you point out, is like really close to the space. Because I think the temptation would be to maybe overweight on one type of user or another and just kind of go like one direction versus, I think, trying to satisfy the two.
Yeah, and what you see is like there is like the responsibility is being reversed, where data engineers have been doing that for a very long time. Like, I'm going to be responsible for all the data pipeline. And it takes data engineers a ton of time to maintain all these pipelines. And what we've discovered is that actually these teams, what they want is to change the direction and just giving access to data users to a platform that they can use and be autonomous with. And so that is why it's very important that we work with both sides, because we want to make sure that the user of this exposed platform are happy, but also that the data engineers who want to not have to do data integration anymore can actually properly hand off the baby to the data users.
Back on the community note, just another question I have is a community management, right? Even just managing a Slack group with that many people, I would imagine is it might be interesting in terms of herding cats, as they say. How did you figure out how to, I guess, manage a growing community, of just a fully distributed group of people?
Yeah. So first of all, I think when you have a community, what is hard is when you bootstrap it, because you need to show and you need to kind of feed your culture into how you want the community to be growing. And this has to come with us. So we, at the beginning, we were just spending like 3/4 of our time on like building this community, replying to people very quickly, giving them like and showing basically showing by example. This is how we want the community to behave. Now, with the community growing, what is nice is you also have people who are not Airbyte's employees who are actually taking over some questions. So, and that shows the example to the new members that are coming in, and you grow like that. And by having set the rule and the expectation from the community, it's just something that continues to grow. Now, I would say something that's often like open source projects suffer from is sometimes the lack of reactivity. You can go on a Slack channel and you can ask a question, and 3 days later you have an answer, or something on the PR. And here we really hold ourselves on very, very tight timelines. And we had to put and the good thing by doing it is we have limited time. So we had to put process in place behind the scene on like, how do we measure all of that? What can we automate? Where do we need to hire to make us better? And we actually created I don't know if that's, we coined the term of user success engineer. And that's one of their roles, which is they are not customer success because we are talking to the open source users, but they are here and they understand the needs of our community members, and they can guide them and educate them on how to use the product and also how to be great at within the community.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, that's one thing I've heard about the Airbyte, community is that when there's an issue, it gets addressed very, very quickly, and that's really cool. I mean, I think that has convinced a lot of people to try it out, and use it, obviously. But yeah, that's interesting. So I mean, you started as you had this open source idea and build a community, and now you're building a company around Airbyte as well. I mean, walk me through that. I've worked at data startups before. They're challenging, and I mean, I'm curious, how you've made the jump to being CEO of a what was, I think, a very popular data startup these days.
Yeah. So first of all, in terms of one second. In terms of the data, building data products, I think data has been dominated by open source since the beginning. It's just that what you do with data is always dependent on like how you work internally. What is your organization? So building open source for us was a no-brainer. Yes, we are a company, so we need to also make money out of the product that we build. But initially, we really want, I mean, right now, what we really want is to make sure that we are building a standard for data integration. And what is interesting is we were not thinking of building the cloud offering until maybe 2022. But what we've seen with our community is that community members were asking us, I love Airbyte, I just don't want to maintain it. And when is the feature of cloud? I call it feature, but in the end, it's a product. But when is the feature of cloud coming up? And we were getting a lot of people asking us for it. And so we kind of changed our milestone a bit to make sure that we can address like the cloud, like the cloud part of it. Now, your question was how did I start as a CEO in a data company?
Yeah. I mean, walk me through that journey real quick. I mean, I can imagine that. I mean, you historically had like individual contributor type roles. You've been a startup founder as well, but now I mean, I think by all accounts have kind of hit trapped lightning in a bottle, so to speak. And and what's that been like?
Yeah, I mean. So first of all, I would say I was not over the past few years, I was going like up and down between IC and manager roles. So when I was at LiveRamp, I was really leading a large part of the engineering organization over there. So in terms of like building a team, recruiting, setting the proper process in place, that is something that I had experience with. So the one where I was more like discovering was around like fundraising, for example. I'd never done, I mean, I had been involved in like fundraising conversation with my RideOS experience, but that was pretty much it. I never had to lead the charge there. And that is where I think when you start a company, finding a great co-founder is like so important. And a co-founder where you have very complementary skills. And my co-founder, for example, had done that in the past. So we were both growing together, him a lot more like the data space, me a lot more like the fundraising and like growing a company side. So we're just stepping, like growing together on these two fronts. I mean, I would say the challenge is your time disappears. And every time you figure out a low-hanging fruit that you can delegate to someone or you can hire for, there is a new one that comes in. By scaling yourself, you're constraining yourself even more. And it's like a constant motion of reinventing yourself to make sure that you have the time to continue to think about the strategic future of the company.
How do you think about the strategic nature of Airbyte?
Yeah, I mean, what do you mean, like the strategy?
Well, I mean, like, you know, I mean, so, I mean, I run into this myself running a business, right? Like, you know, you're focused, as much as you want to focus on strategy, it's one of those things where, as you point out, like it's, you know, you get rid of one thing off your plate, another one immediately shows up. Rinse and repeat. You know, I like to, you know, for me, I set aside Fridays for thinking days. Like I try not to take too many meetings, you know, and it's mainly a day that it's just about thinking about the business and focusing on like, you know, kind of digging beneath, you know, the cover, so to speak. I mean, so strategy, you know, I think it's an important thing for a CEO to do, but I'm always curious, you know, for different leaders, like, how do you think about strategy for your company? Is it, you think about the short-term strategy, the long-term strategy, like macro, micro type strategy for your company?
So yeah, I mean, you obviously need to do both. Like you have to balance the short term and the long term. Like the long term is more like a direction that you're taking. So making sure that all the short term decisions that you're making are getting you closer and closer to your long term goals. I mean, yeah, I mean, for us is really how do we make sure that Airbyte becomes the standard for data integration? And I think we're in a very good position today, given like how quickly the community has been growing and the amount of contribution we get for connectors and the popularity of the protocol. So it's really about like how do we continue and make sure that we get more production usage, that when people think about I need data, oh, Airbyte is there. And every initiative that we have, whether they are short-term or medium-term, are with this in mind. And it's also about like the simplicity. You know, one of the reasons why we are spending so much time with the community to solve the issue is we want to make sure that Airbyte just works. So you take it and it works. You don't have to dive too much into the code. It has to work. And we have to set up the process around like maintenance and connector updates so that we are true to this it just works mantra. And no matter what your scale is, no matter what your data infrastructure looks like, you should be able to just put Airbyte and it should work, and you should be able to get data in a very short amount of time.
Right. It's awesome that even the vision is that I guess explainable, right? Where you know, I like that a lot. It's something I noticed that some founders, they come up with like a vision for where they want to do it, and it's just like it's crazy. They try and explain it. I'm like, I have no idea what you're saying, but I like what you're explaining though. The practice has to work. I think that if it works, the rest of it takes care of itself, right? Like if the community's happy, then you're happy, and
yeah. And in the end, it's data movement. So you should be able to move data from point A to point B, and Airbyte has to work to do that. And if I were to summarize the vision, that's what it would be.
That's interesting. You know, I suppose, you know, to change gears a bit, I mean, so, you know, right now, I think a lot of the And the connector space is basically move data from point A to B, but a lot of it's done in batch mode. I mean, what are your thoughts on where things are going with streaming and event-driven architectures with respect to data integration?
And which one?
Oh, I said with respect to data integration. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a very good question. I would say it's a matter of what latency do you need for your data? And this is not a decision that you take from just the engineering side, it's a business decision. Like, how quickly do I need my data? And what you realize is when you look at streaming, it's a bit ambiguous because sometimes people say streaming when they want to say real time, and real time might also mean sub millisecond or it means sub 5 minutes. So at that point, it's really, we should be talking about like the latency of the data and the type of processing you do after that. I would say if you just think of streaming in terms of data processing, then it doesn't matter like where the data is coming from. It's just that you've set up the pipes that receives events of data, and then you have your processing engine that knows how to process data from a queue. Perfect. And you have like windowing feature to get these insights because your business needs these insights. When we're thinking of data integration, for example, yes, you might have a need for real time, which is not something we're focusing on today because we strongly believe that 95–97% of company will be perfectly okay with sub 5 minutes latency. And the thing is, when you start involving streaming into the equation, like your systems become a lot more complex. The guarantees become a lot harder to, it's a lot harder to give guarantee about a system like that in terms of like data loss, like is it retriable and that kind of thing. So we're really focusing on this micro batches type of architecture, but we know streaming is going to come at some point. But for now, we need to stay focused on what we're doing.
Yeah, it seems to be the case. Like I know that with our client base, I think there's always there's a lot of marketing hype around streaming, I think. And some of it I think is justified depending on what you're doing. If you're working in fintech, for example, or ads, that probably makes a lot of sense. But I think in a lot of use cases, it's and the question I always have is like, if you got data in real time, like what are you going to do with it anyway? Like what action would you take? If you got data every millisecond in a report, like what does that change how you're going to react to that data? At which point you're probably going to automate some action to take care of it anyway.
Exactly.
It's but I suppose,
what you're saying is right. Like fintech is probably super automated, so they might need to have that streaming and just do sub-second decision on the data. But most companies don't have that need.
I mean, what would you say to a company though that is insistent on building like a Kappa architecture? Just everything has to be streaming, and but maybe it's a bit unclear whether or not they need that.
I would really ask them, like, what are you trying to solve that a micro batch or batch system will not be able to solve for you? Like, what insights, what action will you be able to take now that you have this more real-time access to data? And more importantly is like, you probably don't have this use case yet. And do you have the buy-in to make sure that on the business side, they will be ready to make this decision that fast?
Right.
I mean, the thing is, I understand it's a very exciting problem to solve, like real time. So there is like this intellectual curiosity that I also have around streaming, but it's also a matter of like staying pragmatic around like your organization needs.
That's such a good point. I think it's kind of a theme here too. It's about listening to the users, right? Just like you guys do. Seems like in organizations that needs to happen as well with the data teams, especially listening to the end users. Because I think there's a tendency for engineers to want to, engineer things because that's what you get paid to do. So when you set up like, I'd like to get your take on this too, because what I'm seeing is, tooling is getting abstracted right now. There's things like Airbyte, Snowflake, and so forth. Like if you look at what a data engineer or an analyst is doing today versus even 5-10 years ago, it's a much different stack. And I would say that there's more abstraction. Things are becoming way simpler. What do you think a data engineer ends up doing after kind of the low hanging fruit becomes abstracted and simplified?
Yeah, I think there will be other type of challenges around like the quality of the data, the lineage of the data, like everything that can go wrong. The thing is, everything can go wrong with data. It's just data is by definition, it's a mess. You have fragmented pieces of information and you need to make sense out of it. So there will always be this need for like presenting the data the right way, cleaning the data, detecting also if you have access to data that you should not have access to. With GDPR and CCPA, like as a data engineer, you have to be careful about what data you have. Like who has access to that data also externally, you might need to put some limitation. Like data warehouses are amazing because anyone can use data, but not everybody should have access to a social security number or something like that.
Right.
So it becomes like one of the responsibility of the data engineer to enforce like the right practices from the users of the data and make sure that you are like self-conscious about what you're doing with it and exposing it the right way, documenting the data, preparing the data, etc., etc. But building pipe to get fragmented data, this is something that should become a commodity.
Yeah, I agree, and I'm glad that things like Airbyte exist for that reason. It just seems like the amount of undifferentiated heavy lifting that occurs still these days, it's shocking. That people still write like a connector for MySQL to Snowflake or something when that's a very much a solved problem, like by many providers. And so, yeah, hopefully, I've had the same thought. I've been thinking about like what's next for data engineers after, say Airbytes. I had this conversation the other day actually with a data engineer because he's like, okay, so I just get one of these plug and play solutions to move data, to integrate data. And then I move it into Snowflake. And then what do I do? Like, what's my job? And I'm like, I think, your job starts moving higher up the stack, actually, more up the value chain, data governance, probably data governance 2.0, data management, maybe actually having time to write custom code where it's a competitive advantage as well, and not just writing code because you want to write code. So yeah, it's an interesting one. Kind of on that note, where do you see the data space going over the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot more, exactly what you're saying. The data engineering world is going to change. We're going to see a lot more tooling around like control and security and governance, because as you're saying, like as soon as you have data in a warehouse, then suddenly the consumption becomes very easy. And I think what we will see is a lot more tooling being built on top of it to ensure that you have the proper documentation, the proper auditing, the proper lineage, like tracking where the data is coming from. And so it's just we're gonna go much higher we're gonna see more tooling to solve like this basic needs around data. I think like data warehouses are just gonna grow more and more. Like every single company in the world at some point would have a need for a data warehouse. And so that's, I don't want to give advice, but if you can invest in data warehouse companies, that's probably a good bet.
I think so. What's your opinion on the lake house versus the data warehouse?
They solve a similar purpose, I would say. I would say one of the differences is just Lakehouse is really here more as an hybrid solution between data lake for like long running like operational processes, whereas data warehouse are more like here for analytics. And Lakehouse is trying to be this hybrid in the middle. And yeah, I mean, ideally what you want is you want to have a master data set of your data. And you want to be able to plug the tool that makes the most sense for the problem you want to solve, whether it's plugging a streaming processing, plugging like batch processing, plugging analytics warehouse on top of it. You want to be able to just do that. And I think Lakehouse are kind of taking that direction where they've been thought through first for batch processing or streaming processing, and now they're adding these analytics on top of it. And that gives you, master data set. And the system takes care of preparing the data so that it can be best leveraged for your use case.
And the opposite end too, it's interesting. Like Snowflake, for example, now they're starting to incorporate unstructured data into their products. So it seems like they're on a collision course almost. I'm like I was saying earlier today, I'm fascinated to watch this unfold. It's like a boxing match with two heavyweights, and I have no idea who wins this one, or maybe they both win. At the end of the day, it seems like one's becoming like the other. It's sort of like that Spider-Man meme where they're all pointing at each other, and it's the same Spider-Man basically. So it could go either way, I suppose. But it definitely seems like the Lakehouse crowd is becoming more like the data warehouse crowd, and the warehouse crowd is becoming more like the data lake side. So I don't know, it's fascinating to watch, but, and I'm also thinking like there's what interests me is like who's doing something that is none of the above that might actually be better that you've just never heard of yet. And that because in technology that always seems to be the case where it's it's sort of the dark horse out there that you haven't even thought of, or they're just doing something that seems really stupid right now, but it will end up probably being worthwhile at some point. I don't know, but I just know in technology that's always been the case. Like that's tends to happen, which is why you get big jumps in innovation. So
no, I mean it's just like what I see happening is that you will get more layers on top of it. Like DBT is a layer on top of it. Yes, it's closer to SQL, but you're starting to remove yourself a little bit from the warehouse, just a little bit. But I think it's a trend. And the good thing with that trend is you can bring new people that are better with data or better with one specific type of question that they can answer with data. And you can enable these people and make them autonomous, and just your company is going to be better because of that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, think of the impact DBT's had on analysts right now. That's huge, right?
It's huge. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what's funny is that I'm sure that a ton of company had similar internal product for DBT, where they build their own thing internally. It's just, that's where you see how powerful open source is everybody has been building it for the past 15, 20 years. Right. And now suddenly there is a project that comes in and people say, what am I doing that? I can just take it and it's going to go up way better because you have a community of 10,000 people that can help me. And we're doing the same with Airbyte at that time, which is why should I do it? Now it's available. And you get a lot more feedback. And once you work with, sometimes we work on features and we don't know what direction we should be taking. We have more than 2,000 people who can tell us, oh, I prefer that or I prefer that. You have this immediate feedback on how you're thinking about the product from people that know what they want. I mean, sometimes they don't, but sometimes they do.
Yeah, I think for the most part, people do, right? I mean, they kind of, I mean, it's more like they know what they don't want. So, exactly. and I think that's a good true north too. It's like, because you can't see a situation where somebody's going to say, well, I don't want my data to show up on time. Like I want it to show up in a way that is unmanageable and I can't make sense of it. Like it's never going to, it kind of reminds me of Amazon when Jeff Bezos sort of described like the things that don't, when he talks about customer behavior and things that don't change, right? Like people will want things probably cheaper, faster, that kind of thing. There's never a situation where I would say customers want things more expensive and slower like that and low quality, right? Like that just doesn't ever happen. So
yeah, exactly. And so this way you build a much better product. And I think that might be where you get your competitive advantage and innovation is having access to all this feedback. And that, to me, that's one of the reasons why open source has always been so successful on the data world.
What's your opinion on that real quick? I kind of want to get your take on this where, on one hand, there's the open source world and the other hand, you have, players in the space that have done really well taking a closed source approach. I mean, I mean, obviously you started with an open source model, so I would ask if you had a preference, but I think it's indicated by your actions. Like, but what are your thoughts on that? I mean, if you're, I'll just get your general thoughts on that whole mix. So.
Yeah, I would say not everything is a good fit for open source. Like typically, there is a reason why BigQuery, Redshift, and Snowflakes are winners in the data warehouse side. Is implementing a data warehouse, implementing database is a very, very hard problem. And where you need a lot of control on how it's being done. Yes, we have examples with Postgres, MySQL that are open source and that are, but ultimately they are backed by big companies. And I think it will really depend on the type of product. One where you have a huge branching factor is obviously prime for open source, like integration, whether it's inbound or outbound integration. Something like DBT, where you need a lot of little packages or connectors to downstream system or upstream system, that is prime for open source. Yeah, that would be my main thing is, and your data privacy, data security. Today, everything is on cloud, but there are still some need for like running things internally. And open source in general is a very good candidate for that, especially when you work with data. You don't want to be running like foreign code where you cannot have any auditing within your infrastructure. You want to be, and also that puts you at risk where, yeah, if the day that company disappears, you're here with thing that it's not a service yet. You have an infrastructure and you cannot do anything with it. So that is also one aspect why also data is has been very good for open source. Also, you can run code closer to your data, so you don't have to ship your data to a third-party vendor.
Right. Yeah. Well, that makes sense. I really do like the distinction between where closed source would be probably a better model for your business and the open source for others. It's a really good thought. I took some notes here on that because I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, because to build a BigQuery, for example, right, like that's Google's internal tool if they just happen to like release to the public, but there's no way on earth I would say that a startup could build something like BigQuery with like multi-petabit global network, Colossus as your storage layer. Like that seems totally bananas and totally not going to be happening anytime soon. And it's just that this, because the scaling effects you get from that system, for example, is just something that it would be impossible to replicate no matter how hard you tried. Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, so it's sort of like building aircraft carriers versus like maybe something that's a bit more benign. So, like,
yeah. Although Tesla managed to do it with a car,
it's true. That's right, and they built a space company. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So that's awesome.
So it is possible, but
it takes a lot of money, and I think it takes a lot of belief that it's going to keep going too, right? So. Yeah. But then again, if you have something I think that people believe in, Snowflake is a great example. It's like they raised a lot of money and went public, and I think that obviously proved successful to them. And so yeah,
but they were not open source, but they understood like the importance of being close to the data, running on cloud, like the cloud movement that was happening, and they just made sure that they built with cloud in mind. And at that point, you build something similar to what BigQuery is, that works extremely well on cloud, close to the data, very strong privacy and security primitives, and
yeah, it can work either way. It's been a great chat. I guess for people who want to learn more about you or the Airbyte project, I mean, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the first point of entry into the Airbyte community is through our website, airbyte.io, and we see a lot of little buttons to join our Slack community. And the whole team is there, and we have a lot of data engineers, data specialists on the Slack. So if you have any question, you can ask them over there. And otherwise, yeah, pretty much all the information are on the website.
Awesome. Cool. Michel, it's been a really fun talk. And looking forward to talking more with you in the future. So cool. Well, have a good day, and I'll talk to you later. So
thank you, Joe. Thank you for having me.
All right. Well.